the Vampire King, heard a chained Omega's forbidden war chant, then broke formation. When Elara was 7 years old, her grandmother told her a story that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It was winter, and the fire in their small cottage had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the walls, like skeletal fingers reaching for something they could never quite grasp. Her grandmother's weathered hands had gripped hers with surprising strength, her eyes clouded with cataracts, but somehow still piercing, still seeing things that existed beyond the veil of the ordinary world. She had whispered about the old magic, the kind that ran through the bloodlines of the first families, the ones who had walked these lands before the vampires claimed dominion over everything beneath the crimson moon. She spoke of war chants that could shake the foundations of kingdoms, songs so powerful they had been forbidden for 300 years, their very words punishable by death. And then, with her dying breath just moments later, she had sung 3 notes into Elara's ear. Just 3. But those 3 notes contained enough power to change everything. Elara had never forgotten them, had never dared to sing them, had kept them locked away in the deepest chamber of her heart like a weapon she prayed she would never need to use. Until tonight. The chains around Elara's wrists were cold enough to burn, the iron laced with silver and something else, something that hummed against her skin with a nauseating frequency designed specifically to suppress Omega wolves like her. She knelt in the centre of the great hall of Shadowmere Castle, her knees pressed against black marble so polished she could see her own reflection staring back at her, a ghost of the girl she used to be. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around her face, matted with dried blood from the beating she had received when they captured her 3 days ago. Her simple cotton dress, once white, was now torn and stained with mud and crimson. Around her, the court of the Vampire King watched with the detached interest of predators, observing prey that had already lost the will to run. She could feel their eyes on her like cold fingers tracing patterns across her skin, cataloguing her weaknesses, measuring how long she might last as entertainment before she broke completely. But Elara was not broken. Not yet. Not ever. She had been on the run for 2 years, ever since her pack had been slaughtered in the Purge, ever since she had watched her father die trying to protect families who scattered like leaves in a storm the moment the vampires descended from the mountains. She had survived by being invisible, by suppressing every instinct that screamed at her to fight back, by making herself small and unremarkable, and beneath notice. She had worked in taverns and cleaned stables, and slept in barns, always moving, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions about the girl, with eyes that sometimes flashed gold in the darkness. She had been so careful, so desperately careful. But 3 nights ago, she had made a mistake. She had defended another Omega, a young girl barely 16, from a vampire who had decided to make sport of her fear. Elara had acted on instinct, had let her wolf rise just enough to bare her teeth, and growl a warning that vibrated with command, with the authority that should have been impossible for someone of her rank. And they had noticed. The doors at the far end of the hall opened with a sound like thunder, and every vampire in the room turned as one, their movements synchronized in a way that was deeply unnatural, deeply wrong. Elara kept her eyes on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack, but even without looking, she could feel him enter the room. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The very air seemed to contract, to bow, to acknowledge the presence of something ancient and terrible and absolute. She had heard stories about the Vampire King for her entire life, whispered tales of his cruelty and his power, of the way he had unified the vampire clans 3 centuries ago through blood and fire and sheer, unstoppable will. They said he had walked through the heart of a bonfire to claim his throne. They said he could read thoughts as easily as others read books. They said he had not felt a single human emotion in over 500 years, that his heart was a frozen wasteland where empathy went to die. His footsteps echoed across the marble, each one measured and deliberate, the sound of inevitability approaching. Elara's wolf, usually so quiet and compliant after years of suppression, suddenly stirred in her chest, pressing against her consciousness with an urgency that bordered on panic. Every instinct screamed at her to look up, to meet the gaze of the predator moving toward her, to assess the threat. But she kept her eyes down, focusing on her own trembling reflection, in the black marble, on the chains that bound her, on anything except the overwhelming presence that now filled the entire hall like smoke. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. She could see his boots in her peripheral vision, black leather polished to a mirror shine, expensive and perfectly tailored like everything else. About him undoubtedly was. The silence stretched out, taut and suffocating, until she thought she might scream just to break it. And then he spoke, and his voice was nothing like she had expected. It was not the rasp of something dead and decaying, not the melodramatic thunder of a tyrant. It was smooth and deep and cultured, with an accent that spoke of old money and older bloodlines, the kind of voice that could convince you to walk into darkness willingly, eagerly, grateful for the privilege of your own destruction. Look at me. 2 words, not a request. A command that carried the weight of absolute authority, the expectation of instant obedience. Elara's body responded before her mind could catch up, her head lifting, her eyes travelling up the length of a frame that was tall and powerfully built, broad shoulders encased in a black suit that probably cost more than her entire village had earned in a year, until finally, inevitably, her gaze locked with his. The world stopped. She had expected cruelty. She had expected the flat, dead eyes of a monster who had long ago forgotten what it meant to be anything other than a predator. What she had not expected was beauty so severe it was almost painful to witness, features carved from pale marble with a precision that seemed deliberate, designed to lure and captivate and destroy. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that were full and sensual despite the hardness in every other aspect of his face. His hair was black as midnight and fell to his shoulders in waves that caught the light from the chandeliers overhead. But it was his eyes that truly stole her breath, eyes that were silver like moonlight on water, like mercury, like the edge of a blade catching light before it fell. And in those eyes, impossible and undeniable, she saw recognition. Not the simple acknowledgement of a king noticing one more prisoner among thousands. This was something deeper, something that made his expression shift for just a fraction of a second, a crack in the perfect mask of indifference that revealed something hungry and desperate and utterly uncontrolled before he locked it away again. His nostrils flared slightly as he inhaled, scenting her, and his hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, suddenly clenched into fists tight enough that she heard the leather of his gloves creak. "Who are you?" he asked, and there was something in his voice now, an edge of something that might have been confusion or might have been anger. She could not tell, could not think clearly, when his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel like he was peeling back layers of her soul to examine what lay beneath. "No one, Your Majesty," Elara whispered, her voice rough from disuse and fear. "I am no one." His head tilted slightly, a predator's assessment, and he took a step closer. The vampires lining the wall shifted, a collective intake of breath that spoke of surprise. Apparently the king did not usually deign to move closer to prisoners. Apparently this was unusual. His proximity made Elara's wolf surge forward again, and she had to bite the inside of her cheek, hard enough to taste blood, to keep from doing something monumentally stupid, like trying to shift while bound in chains specifically designed to prevent exactly that. "Liar," he said softly, and the word was almost gentle, almost amused. "You are many things, little wolf, but you are not no one. I can smell the power in your blood. Old power, the kind that has been sleeping for generations." He crouched down suddenly, bringing himself to her eye level, close enough that she could see flecks of darker silver in his irises, close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold that radiated from him, like winter given form. "Tell me your name." She should have given him a false one. She should have protected the last piece of her identity that remained untouched by chains and captivity. But when his eyes met hers again at this distance, when she felt the full force of his attention focused on her like the point of a spear, the truth fell from her lips before she could stop it. "Elara," she breathed. "Elara Nightsong." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Vampire King's eyes widened, genuine shock breaking through his carefully controlled expression. Around the hall she heard gasps, heard the scrape of weapons being drawn, heard her surname echo off the walls, like an accusation. Nightsong, the family that had led the last great rebellion, the bloodline that had been systematically hunted to extinction, every man, woman, and child bearing that name, executed publicly as a warning to anyone who might consider defying vampire rule, the bloodline that should no longer exist. "Impossible," someone said from the crowd. A tall vampire with white hair, and a scar across his throat. "The Nightsongs are dead, we made certain of it." The king did not look away from Elara. His hand reached out slowly, giving her time to flinch away if she chose, and his fingers caught her chin, tilting her face toward the light. His touch was cool and firm, and sent a shock of something electric racing down her spine, something that had no business existing between a predator and prey, between a king and a prisoner, between a vampire and a wolf. "The eyes," he murmured, almost to himself, "gold flecked with green, and the bone structure." His thumb traced along her jaw in a gesture that was far too intimate, far too possessive for someone he had met mere minutes ago. "You look like her, remarkably like her." "Like who?" Elara asked, though part of her already knew, had heard the stories whispered around fires when she was young. "Like the woman who nearly killed me 200 years ago," the king said, and there was something in his voice now that might have been respect or might have been rage. "Like Morgana Nightsong, who led 10,000 wolves against my armies and came within a sword's length of taking my head." His eyes searched hers, looking for something she did not understand. "What relation was she to you?" "My great-great-grandmother," Elara whispered. "She died the day you burned Silverpine to the ground." She watched emotions flicker across his face, too quickly to name, watched him process this information with the calculating efficiency of someone who had ruled kingdoms for longer than she could comprehend. And then slowly he released her chin and stood, turning to address the assembled court. "This changes things," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the vast hall. "Leave us." The silence that followed was absolute. Elara could practically feel the shock radiating from the vampires around her, could see their faces reflected in the marble, expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. The white-haired vampire with the scar stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "My lord, surely you cannot mean to." "I believe I gave you an order, Cassius," the king said without turning around, his voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze blood in veins. "Unless you wish to challenge it." Cassius's face went carefully blank, and he bowed stiffly before turning on his heel and striding toward the doors. The others followed in a rustle of silk and leather and suppressed fury, their footsteps echoing away until finally the great doors swung shut with a boom that sounded like a death knell. And Elara was alone with the vampire king. He stood with his back to her for a long moment, his shoulders tense beneath the perfect lines of his suit, and she had the strangest sense that he was trying to compose himself, trying to decide what to do with her. When he finally turned around, his expression was unreadable, the mask firmly back in place. "Stand up," he said. Elara tried, but the chains were short, forcing her to remain in a half-crouch that sent stabbing pains through her legs. She had been kneeling for over an hour, and her muscles had long since begun to cramp. She managed to get one foot under her before her knee buckled and she pitched forward, bracing for impact with the unforgiving marble. It never came. He moved faster than her eyes could track, crossing the distance between them in a blur of motion, catching her before she fell. His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against his chest, and the cold of him seeped through her thin dress like ice water. But beneath the cold, she felt something else, something that radiated from him despite the undead nature of his body. Power. Raw and ancient and absolutely controlled, held in check by will alone. "Careful," he murmured, and his breath stirred the hair at her temple. "I cannot have you damaging yourself before I decide what to do with you." She should have been terrified. Every rational thought screamed that she was in the arms of a monster, that this was the creature who had ordered the deaths of thousands of her kind, who had built his throne on bones and rivers of blood. But the hand at her waist was gentle, steadying her without crushing, and when she tilted her head back to look at him, she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like concern, before it vanished behind silver frost. "What are you going to do with me?" she asked, hating how breathless she sounded, hating the way her heart raced for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the pale skin. "I have not decided yet," he admitted, and the honesty surprised her. "You are a complication I did not anticipate. The last Nightsong. The council will demand your execution. They will call you a threat, a symbol that could inspire rebellion among the remaining wolf packs." "Are they wrong?" Elara asked quietly. She should have stayed silent, should have played the part of the frightened prisoner, grateful to still be breathing. But something about the way he looked at her, the way he held her like she was something precious rather than something disposable, made her bold. "Would you not execute me if our positions were reversed? If I were the queen and you were the last survivor of a line that had tried to destroy everything I built?" A slow smile curved his lips, and it was a dangerous thing, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "Oh, little wolf," he said softly, "if you were a queen and I were at your mercy, execution would be a kindness compared to what you should do to me." His hand moved from her waist to her wrist, his fingers wrapping around the iron cuff that bound her. His brow furrowed slightly, and she saw his nostrils flare again. "These are hurting you." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway. The silver in the iron had been burning her skin for 3 days, leaving raw wounds beneath the metal that wept and refused to heal. He made a sound low in his throat that was almost a growl, almost disapproving, and then he grasped the chain connecting her wrists and simply pulled. The metal shrieked in protest before snapping like thread, and suddenly her hands were free, the cuffs still locked around her wrists but no longer binding her arms together. Elara stared at the broken chain, then at him, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. "Why would you?" "Because I do not torture prisoners," he said flatly. "Whatever else I may be, I'm not needlessly cruel." He released her, stepping back to put distance between them, and she felt the loss of his cold warmth like a physical ache. "You will stay in the castle, not in the dungeons," he added quickly when he saw her expression. "In the East Wing, in rooms befitting a guest." "A prisoner in silk chains instead of iron ones," Elara said. "Yes," he agreed without hesitation. "Until I decide what to do with you, you will be confined to those rooms. You will be fed, clothed, given whatever you require to be comfortable. But you will not leave, and you will not attempt to escape." His eyes locked with hers. "Do I have your word?" She should have refused. She should have spit in his face and told him she would never give her word to a monster. But something in his gaze held her, something that felt like a challenge and a plea wrapped together, and she found herself nodding before she fully understood why. "You have my word," she whispered, "but I want something in return." His eyebrows rose, surprise and what might have been amusement flickering across his features. "You are in no position to negotiate, little wolf." "Then you should not have asked for my word," Elara countered. "You should have simply locked me in your pretty cage and been done with it. But you asked, which means you want my cooperation, not just my compliance, so yes, I want something in return." The smile that curved his lips this time was genuine, lighting his eyes with something that looked almost like delight. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Your great-great-grandmother had the same fire." "Very well. What do you want?" "Answers," Elara said. "Truth for truth. I will tell you anything you wish to know about me, about my bloodline, about whatever it is you are really after. And in return, you will answer my questions with the same honesty. No lies, no half-truths. Just truth." He studied her for a long moment, his head tilted slightly, and she had the unsettling sense that he was seeing past her skin and bones to something deeper, something she had kept hidden, even from herself. Finally he nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Agreed," he said. "Truth for truth. Starting now." He gestured to a pair of chairs near the massive fireplace that dominated one wall of the hall, ornate things of carved wood and dark velvet that looked like thrones in miniature. "Sit. You look ready to collapse." Elara's legs chose that moment to prove him right, trembling violently enough that she had to grab the arm of the chair to lower herself into it without falling. He settled into the chair opposite her with the fluid grace of a predator, crossing one leg over the other, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, as he regarded her. "First question," he said. "How did you survive? After the purge, we searched for years for any remaining Nightsongs. We found nothing." "My mother hid me," Elara said quietly. "Changed my name, taught me to suppress my power, made me promise to never shift in front of anyone who might recognize what I was. She died when I was 10, and I've been running ever since." Something flickered in his eyes. "I am sorry for your loss." The words were so unexpected, so seemingly genuine, that Elara could only stare at him. "You ordered the purge that killed her," she said finally. "Why would you be sorry?" "Because I understand what it is to lose a mother," he replied. and there was a weight to the words that spoke of ancient grief. And because I have lived long enough to regret many of the choices I made in the name of maintaining power. He leaned forward slightly. Your turn. Ask your question. Elara's mind raced with 1,000 things she wanted to know, but one question rose above all the others, the one that had been burning in her chest since the moment their eyes first met. When you looked at me, she said slowly, you recognized me. Not just my name or my bloodline. You recognized me. Why, I have never seen you before in my life. His expression shuttered immediately, walls slamming down behind his eyes, and for a moment she thought he would refuse to answer, would call off their bargain, and throw her in the dungeons after all. But then he closed his eyes, his jaw working, as though forcing out words that had been locked away for centuries. Because you look exactly like her, he said quietly. And because when I looked at you, I felt something I have not felt in 500 years. Something I thought I had burned out of myself long ago. He opened his eyes and the naked vulnerability in them stole her breath. I felt human. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to process what he was telling her, tried to understand the implications. That is not an answer, she whispered. That is a riddle. Then let me make it clearer, he said, and suddenly he was moving again, leaving his chair to kneel in front of hers, bringing them eye to eye once more. His hands gripped the arms of her chair, caging her in without touching her, and she could see the war raging behind his eyes, centuries of control, battling against something wild and desperate. When you are turned into a vampire, especially one as old as I am, you lose pieces of yourself. Emotions become muted, distant things. Food has no taste. Music becomes just noise. The world fades to grey, and you exist in that grey for so long that you forget what colour even looked like. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But when I looked at you, little wolf, the world blazed into colour. And I cannot explain it, cannot rationalise it, cannot make it fit into any framework of logic I have built over 5 centuries. I only know that it terrifies me more than anything has in longer than I can remember. Elara could not breathe, could not think, could only stare into those silver eyes and see the truth burning there, undeniable and impossible and real. You do not even know me, she managed. No, he agreed. But I knew her, your great-great-grandmother. Before the war, before she became my enemy, I knew her. He lifted one hand slowly, telegraphing the movement, and brushed a strand of hair back from Elara's face, with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone capable of the violence she knew he commanded. We were allies once, she and I, before I was turned, when I was still human, still just a lord trying to protect his lands from the vampire clans that raided in the night. She fought beside me, saved my life more than once. And I... He trailed off, something like pain crossing his features. You what? Elara breathed. I loved her, he said simply. With everything I had, everything I was. I was going to ask her to marry me the night I was turned. The night a vampire I had trusted betrayed me and forced his blood down my throat while his maker drained me dry and brought me back as something other, something less. His hand dropped away from her face. When I woke 3 days later, different and wrong and monstrous, the first thing I did was go to her. I thought she would understand, thought perhaps she could still love what I had become. But when she looked at me, all I saw was horror and disgust. She tried to kill me, nearly succeeded. And He closed his eyes. I let her walk away, let her live when I should have ended the threat then and there, and 50 years later, when she gathered the packs for rebellion, I told myself she had to die, told myself it was strategic, necessary. But the truth is, I wanted her dead because I could not stand existing in a world where she lived and hated me. The weight of his confession pressed down on Elara like a physical thing. 500 years of grief and rage and loss, carried in silence, locked away behind the mask of a ruthless king. Did you kill her yourself? She asked quietly. No, he said. Cassius did, in the final battle. Put a sword through her heart while I was engaged with her beta. I did not even see it happen, only found her body afterward when the fighting had ended. He opened his eyes and they were haunted. I carried her from that battlefield myself, buried her in a place no one else knows, somewhere beautiful and peaceful, the kind of place she used to love. And I have visited her grave every year on the anniversary of her death for 200 years. And I have apologized for failing her, for becoming the monster she saw when she looked at me. Tears burned in Elara's eyes, sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. She did not cry for herself, for her imprisonment or her fear. She cried for the tragedy of it, for two people who had loved each other and been torn apart by forces beyond their control, by the darkness that had claimed one and the hatred it had bred in the other. "What is your name?" she asked through her tears. "Your real name from before." His expression softened. "Rowan," he said quietly. "Rowan Ashford, though no one has called me that in centuries." "Rowan," she repeated, tasting the name, and watched something in him shudder at the sound of it in her voice. "I am sorry for what happened to you, for what you lost." "Do not be sorry for me," he said roughly. "I am a monster, Elara. I have done things that would turn your stomach, ordered atrocities in the name of control and power. I do not deserve your compassion." "Maybe not," she agreed, "but you have it anyway." He stared at her like she had struck him, and then, moving so slowly she could have stopped him at any moment, he reached up and caught one of her tears on his finger. He looked at it for a long moment, this tiny drop of salt water, like it was the most precious thing he had ever seen. And then, impossibly, he brought it to his lips and tasted it, his eyes closing. "I had forgotten," he murmured, so quietly she almost did not hear him, what tears tasted like. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them could name, and Elara felt something shift in her chest, something that felt like a lock turning, like a door opening that she had kept sealed her entire life. This was madness. He was her enemy, the architect of her family's destruction, the reason she had spent her whole life running and hiding, and afraid. She should hate him with every fibre of her being, but when she looked at him, really looked past the crown and the power and the blood on his hands, all she saw was someone who had been alone for 500 years, carrying grief that would have broken anyone else, and yet still searching for colour in a grey world. "Stand up," she said softly. He obeyed immediately, rising to his feet in one fluid movement, and she stood as well, swaying slightly as her abused muscles protested. They stood close, so close she could see the ring of darker silver around his pupils, could count his eyelashes if she wanted to, could feel the cold radiating from him like winter given form. Slowly, giving him every chance to move away, she lifted her hand and placed it over where his heart should have been beating. There was nothing. No pulse, no warmth, no sign of life. Just cold stillness beneath her palm. "You are not a monster," she said firmly. "You are someone who had monstrosity forced upon you, and you spent 500 years proving that the vampire who made you was right to fear what you would become. Because you became exactly the thing he created you to be. But that was a choice, Rowan, and choices can be unmade." His hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his chest, and his eyes blazed with something fierce and desperate. "Why are you doing this?" he asked hoarsely. "Why are you not afraid of me?" "I am terrified of you," Elara admitted. "But I'm also tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being alone, and I think—" She took a shaking breath. "I think you are tired too. I think you have been tired for a very long time." "Yes," he breathed. "God, yes." And then he was moving, his free hand coming up to cut the back of her head, his fingers threading through her hair as he pulled her closer, and she could see the question in his eyes, the desperate need for permission. She should have said no, should have pulled away and preserved the small amount of safety that distance provided. Instead, she tilted her face up to his and whispered, "Yes." He kissed her like a man dying of thirst finally given water, his mouth claiming hers with a desperate hunger that should have frightened her, but instead sent fire racing through her veins. His lips were cool against hers, but beneath the cold there was heat, fierce and demanding and real. She gasped against his mouth, and he took advantage, deepening the kiss, one hand fisting in her hair, while the other wrapped around her waist and pulled her flush against him. Elara's hands found his shoulders, gripping the expensive fabric of his suit as her knees went weak, as everything in her world narrowed down to this moment. This kiss, this impossible connection between a wolf and a vampire, between a prisoner and a king, between two people who should have been enemies but felt instead like two halves of the same wounded soul. He broke away just far enough to press his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard, his chest heaving despite not needing air. "This is madness," he said roughly. "Yes," she agreed. "The court will never accept it. They will call for your death with even more fervour when they learn." "I know." "We cannot. This cannot." He cut himself off, his jaw clenching. "You should run from me, Elara Nightsong. You should hate me and fear me, and want nothing more than to see me destroyed." "I know that too," she whispered. "But I heard what you said, about the world being grey. And I understand it because my world has been grey since the day I watched my father die, since the day I realised I would never have a home, or a pack, or anything that was not built on fear and survival. But when you look at me, Rowan, I feel like I might remember what colour looks like." He made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and kissed her again, softer this time, but no less intense, his lips moving against hers like a prayer, like an apology, like a promise neither of them should make. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, if vampires could cry. "What have you done to me?" he asked wonderingly. "In the space of an hour, you have undone centuries of carefully constructed walls." "Maybe they were ready to fall," Elara suggested. "Maybe," he agreed. He released her reluctantly, stepping back, and she saw him visibly gathering his control around himself again, piece by piece. "I need to think. Need to figure out how to navigate this without getting you killed." His eyes hardened slightly. "The council meets tomorrow night. They will demand an audience, demand to know why I have not executed you. I need to give them an answer that will satisfy them without revealing that you have feelings for me," Elara finished quietly. "Yes." He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling the perfect waves. "For now, you need to go to the rooms I mentioned. There are guards outside who will escort you. Do not antagonize them. Do not try to leave, and do not—" He trailed off, something almost like desperation crossing his face. "Do not sing." Elara went very still. "What?" His eyes met hers and they were haunted again. "When they brought you in, before I entered the hall, I heard something. A few notes of a song I have not heard in 300 years. A war chant that should be impossible for anyone to know because everyone who knew it is dead." He moved closer again, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Do not sing it, Elara. Whatever power runs in your blood, whatever your grandmother taught you, do not let them hear it. Because if they know what you can do, what you might become, no force in this world, or any other, will be able to keep you alive. Do you understand?" She thought of her grandmother's dying breath, of the 3 notes that had contained enough power to make her bones vibrate with recognition of something older than words. "I understand." "Good." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, achingly gentle. "Go, before I do something else foolish, like lock you in my chambers and declare war on my entire court to keep you safe." Elara wanted to tell him that maybe that would not be such a bad thing, but the doors at the far end of the hall were already opening, and 2 guards in black armour were entering, their expressions carefully neutral. She backed away from Rowan, from the Vampire King, trying to put distance between them that might restore some semblance of propriety. His hand fell to his side, and she watched the mask slide back into place, watched him become the cold, distant monarch once more. But his eyes, those silver eyes, still burned with heat that had nothing to do with temperature. "Take her to the East Wing," he commanded the guards. "See that she has everything she requires. And understand that she is under my personal protection. Anyone who harms her answers to me directly." The guards bowed, clearly surprised by the order but too well trained to question it. One of them gestured politely for Elara to follow, and she did, casting one last look over her shoulder as she reached the doors. Rowan stood alone in the centre of the great hall, watching her go, and on his face was an expression of such raw longing that it made her chest ache. And then she was through the doors, being led down corridors of black stone and dark tapestries, climbing stairs that spiralled upward, into towers that touched the sky. The guards did not speak to her, did not even look at her directly, just maintained a respectful distance, as they guided her to a set of double doors carved with images of wolves and vampires locked in eternal battle. One of them opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Elara stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The room was enormous, easily the size of the entire cottage she'd grown up in, with high ceilings and tall windows that overlooked the mountains. A massive four-poster bed dominated one wall, draped in curtains of deep emerald silk. A fireplace large enough to stand in crackled with welcoming warmth. There were bookshelves, a writing desk, a sitting area with plush chairs, and through an open doorway she could see a bathroom with a tub that could have fit 4 people comfortably. "His Majesty's orders were that you be made comfortable," one of the guards said from the doorway. "There are clothes in the wardrobe, food and drink on the table. If you require anything else, pull the cord by the bed and someone will attend to you. But you are not to leave these rooms without express permission from the king himself. Do you understand?" "Yes," Elara said quietly. "Thank you." The guards withdrew and she heard a key turn in the lock from the outside, a prisoner in silk chains just as she had said. But as she moved to the window and looked out over the kingdom bathed in moonlight, as she replayed the feel of Rowan's lips against hers, the desperate way he had held her like she was something precious, she realised that she did not feel like a prisoner at all. She felt for the first time in her life like she might be exactly where she was meant to be. But as she stood there, as exhaustion finally began to drag at her bones and her mind started to quiet, she heard it. Faint and distant, carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the castle. A voice, high and clear and terrible, singing a song that made her blood run cold and her wolf surge forward with recognition. Someone else knew the war chant, and they were calling for revolution. Elara's hands gripped the windowsill hard enough to make her knuckles white as the implications crashed over her like a wave. She had promised Rowan she would not sing, had promised she would not become the symbol that could unite the wolves in rebellion. But what if she was not the only Nightsong who had survived? What if someone else had already taken up the mantle she had spent her whole life running from? And what would Rowan do when he discovered that the revolution he feared was not a possibility, but an inevitability? Outside, the moon blazed full and red in the sky, and somewhere in the darkness, wolves began to howl.